When Dick Sands spoke of this incident to Mrs. Weldon, the latter, though she shared his distrust in a certain measure, could find no plausible motive for what would be criminal premeditation on the part of the head cook. However, as a matter of prudence, Negoro was well watched. Thereafter he attended to the novice's orders and he did not risk coming aft in the ship, where his duties never called him. Besides, Dingo having been installed there permanently, the cook took Ern to keep away. During all that week the tempest did not abate. The barometer fell again. From the 14th to the 26th of March, it was impossible to profit by a single calm to set a few sails. The Pilgrim scudded to the northeast with a speed which could not be less than 200 miles in 24 hours, and still the land did not appear. That land, America, which is thrown like an immense barrier between the Atlantic and the Pacific, over an extent of more than 120 degrees. Dick Sand asked himself if he was not a fool, if he was still in his right mind, if for so many days, unknown to him, he was not sailing in a false direction. No, he could not find fault with himself on that point. The sun, even though he could not perceive it in the fogs, always rose before him to set behind him. But then that land, had it disappeared? That America, on which his vessel would go to pieces, perhaps, where was it if it was not there? Be it the southern continent or the northern continent, for anything way possible in that chaos, the Pilgrim could not miss either one or the other. What had happened since the beginning of this frightful tempest? What was still going on as that coast, whether it should prove salvation or destruction, did not appear? Must Dick Sand suppose, then, that he was deceived by his compass, whose indications he could no longer control, because the second compass was lacking to make that control? Truly, he had that fear which the absence of all land might justify. So, when he was at the helm, Dick Sand did not cease to devour the chart with his eyes. But he interrogated it in vain. It could not give him the solution of an enigma which, in the situation in which Negoro had placed him, was incomprehensible for him, as it would have been for anyone else. On this day, however, the 26th of March, towards 8 o'clock in the morning, an incident of the greatest importance took place. Hercules, on watch forward, gave this cry: "Land, land!" Dick Sand sprang to the forecastle. Hercules could not have eyes like a seaman, was he not mistaken? "Land!" cried Dick Sand. "There," replied Hercules, showing an almost imperceptible point on the horizon in the northeast. They hardly heard each other speak in the midst of the roaring of the sea and the sky. "You have seen the land," said the novice. "Yes," replied Hercules. And his hand was still stretched out to larboard forward. The novice looked, he saw nothing. At that moment, Mrs. Weldon, who had heard the cry given by Hercules, came up on deck, notwithstanding her promise not to come there. "Madam," cried Dick Sand. Mrs. Weldon, unable to make herself heard, tried, for herself, to perceive that land signaled by the black, and she seemed to have concentrated all her life in her eyes. It must be believed that Hercules's hand indicated badly the point of the horizon which he wished to show. Neither Mrs. Weldon nor the novice could see anything. But suddenly, Dick Sand in turn stretched out his hand. "Yes, yes, land," said he. A kind of summit had just appeared in an opening in the fog. His sailor's eyes could not deceive him. "At last," cried he, "at last." He clung feverishly to the netting. Mrs. Weldon, sustained by Hercules, continued to watch that land almost despaired of. The coast, formed by that high summit, rose at a distance of 10 miles to leeward. The opening being completely made in a breaking of the clouds, they saw it again more distinctly. Doubtless it was some promontory of the American continent. The Pilgrim, without sails, was not in a condition to head toward it, but it could not fail to make the land there. That could be only a question of a few hours. Now it was 8 o'clock in the morning. Then, very certainly, before noon the Pilgrim would be near the land. At a sign from Dick Sand, Hercules led Mrs. Weldon aft again, for she could not bear up against the violence of the pitching. The novice remained forward for another instant, then he returned to the helm, near Old Tom. At last, then, he saw that coast, so slowly made, so ardently desired, but it was now with a feeling of terror. In fact, in the Pilgrim's present condition, that is to say, scudding before the tempest, land to leeward, was shipwreck with all its terrible contingencies. 2 hours passed away. The promontory was then seen off from the ship. At that moment, they saw Negoro come on deck. This time, he regarded the coast with extreme attention, shook his head like a man who would know what to believe, and went down again, after pronouncing a name that nobody could hear. Dick Sand himself sought to perceive the coast, which ought to round off behind the promontory. 2 hours rolled by. The promontory was standing on the larboard stern, but the coast was not yet to be traced. Meanwhile, the sky cleared at the horizon, and a high coast, like the American land, bordered by the immense chain of the Andes, should be visible for more than 20 miles. Dick Sand took his telescope and moved it slowly over the whole eastern horizon. Nothing, he could see nothing. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, every trace of land had disappeared behind the Pilgrim. Forward, the telescope could not seize any outline whatsoever of a coast, high or low. Then a cry escaped Dick Sand. Immediately leaving the deck, he rushed into the cabin, where Mrs. Weldon was with little Jack, Nan, and cousin Benedict. "An island, that was only an island," said he. "An island, Dick, but what?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "The chart will tell us," replied the novice. And running to his berth, he brought the ship's chart. "There, Mrs. Weldon, there," said he. "That land which we have seen, it can only be this point, lost in the middle of the Pacific. It can only be the Isle of Pax, there is no other in these parts." "And we have already left it behind?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Yes, well to the windward of us." Mrs. Weldon looked attentively at the Isle of Pax, which only formed an imperceptible point on the chart. "And at what distance is it from the American coast?" 35 degrees. "Which makes about 2,000 miles. But then the Pilgrim has not sailed, if we are still so far from the continent." "Mrs. Weldon," replied Dick Sand, who passed his hand over his forehead for a moment, as if to concentrate his ideas. "I do not know, I cannot explain this incredible delay. No, I cannot, unless the indications of the compass have been false. But that island can only be the Isle of Pax, because we have been obliged to scud before the wind to the northeast, and we must thank heaven, which has permitted me to mark our position. Yes, it is still 2,000 miles from the coast. I know, at last, where the tempest has blown us, and, if it abates, we shall be able to land on the American continent with some chance of safety. Now, at least, our ship is no longer lost on the immensity of the Pacific." This confidence, shown by the young novice, was shared by all those who heard him speak. Mrs. Weldon herself gave way to it. It seemed, indeed, that these poor people were at the end of their troubles, and that the Pilgrim, being to the windward of her port, had only to wait for the open sea to enter it. The Isle of Pax, by its true name Vaihon, discovered by David in 1686, visited by Cook and Leprous, is situate degrees south latitude and degrees east longitude. If the schooner had been thus led more than 15 degrees to the north, that was evidently due to that tempest from the southwest, before which it had been obliged to scud. Then the Pilgrim was still 2,000 miles from the coast. However, under the impetus of that wind which blew like thunder, it must, in less than 10 days, reach some point of the coast of South America. But could they not hope, as the novice had said, that the weather would become more manageable, and that it would be possible to set some sail when they should make the land? It was still Dick Sand's hope. He said to himself that this hurricane, which had lasted so many days, would end perhaps by killing itself. And now that, thanks to the appearance of the Isle of Pax, he knew exactly his position, he had reason to believe that, once master of his vessel again, he would know how to lead her to a safe place. Yes, to have had knowledge of that isolated point in the middle of the sea, as by a providential favor, that had restored confidence to Dick Sand. If he was going all the time at the caprice of a hurricane, which he could not subdue, at least, he was no longer going quite blindfold. Besides, the Pilgrim, well built and rigged, had suffered little during those rude attacks of the tempest. Her damages reduced themselves to the loss of the topsail and the foretopmast staysail, a loss which it would be easy to repair. Not a drop of water had penetrated through the well-staunched seams of the hull and the deck. The pumps were perfectly free. In this respect there was nothing to fear. There was then this interminable hurricane, whose fury nothing seemed able to moderate. If, in a certain measure, Dick Sand could put his ship in a condition to struggle against the violent storm, he could not order that wind to moderate, those waves to be still, that sky to become serene again. On board, if he was master after God, outside the ship, God alone commanded the winds and the waves. Chapter 13. Land. Meanwhile, that confidence with which Dick Sand's heart filled instinctively was going to be partly justified. The next day, March 27th, the column of mercury rose in the barometrical tube. The oscillation was neither sudden nor considerable, a few lines only, but the progression seemed likely to continue. The tempest was evidently going to enter its decreasing period, and, if the sea did remain excessively rough, they could tell that the wind was going down, veering slightly to the west. Dick Sand could not yet think of using any sail. The smallest sail would be carried away. However, he hoped that 24 hours would not elapse before it would be possible for him to rig a storm jib. During the night, in fact, the wind went down quite noticeably, if they compared it to what it had been till then, and the ship was less tossed by those violent rollings which had threatened to break her in pieces. The passengers began to appear on deck again. They no longer ran the risk of being carried away by some surge from the sea. Mrs. Weldon was the first to leave the hatchway where Dick Sand, from prudent motives, had obliged them to shut themselves up during the whole duration of that long tempest. She came to talk with the novice, whom a truly superhuman will had rendered capable of resisting so much fatigue. Thin, pale under his sunburnt complexion, he might well be weakened by the loss of that sleep so necessary at his age. No, his valiant nature resisted everything. Perhaps he would pay dearly some day for that period of trial, but that was not the moment to allow himself to be cast down. Dick Sand had said all that to himself. Mrs. Weldon found him as energetic as he had ever been. And then he had confidence, that brave Sand, and if confidence does not command itself, at least it commands. "Dick, my dear child, my captain," said Mrs. Weldon, holding out her hand to the young novice. "Ah, Mrs. Weldon," exclaimed Dick Sand, smiling, "you disobey your captain. You return on deck, you leave your cabin in spite of his prayers." "Yes, I disobey you," replied Mrs. Weldon, "but I have, as it were, a presentiment that the tempest is going down or is going to become calm." "It is becoming calm, in fact, Mrs. Weldon," replied the novice. "You are not mistaken. The barometer has not fallen since yesterday. The wind has moderated, and I have reason to believe that our hardest trials are over." "Heaven hears you, Dick. You have suffered much, my poor child." "You have done there." "Only my duty, Mrs. Weldon." "But at last will you be able to take some rest?" "Rest," replied the novice. "I have no need of rest, Mrs. Weldon. I am well, thank God, and it is necessary for me to keep up to the end. You have called me captain, and I shall remain captain till the moment when all the Pilgrim's passengers shall be in safety." "Dick," returned Mrs. Weldon, "my husband and I, we shall never forget what you have just done." "God has done all," replied Dick Sand, "all. My child, I repeat it, that by your moral and physical energy, you have shown yourself a man fit to command, and before long, as soon as your studies are finished, my husband will not contradict me, you will command for the house of James W. Weldon." "I," exclaimed Dick Sand, whose eyes filled with tears. "Dick," replied Mrs. Weldon, "you are already our child by adoption, and now, you are our son, the deliverer of your mother and of your little brother, Jack. My dear Dick, I embrace you for my husband and for myself." The courageous woman did not wish to give way while clasping the young novice in her arms, but her heart overflowed. As to Dick Sand's feelings, what pen could do them justice? He asked himself if he could not do more than give his life for his benefactors, and he accepted in advance all the trials which might come upon him in the future. After this conversation, Dick Sand felt stronger. If the wind should become so moderate that he should be able to hoist some canvas, he did not doubt being able to steer his ship to a port where all those which it carried would at last be in safety. On the 29th, the wind having moderated a little, Dick Sand thought of setting the foresail and the topsail, consequently to increase the speed of the Pilgrim, while directing her course. "Come, Tom, come, my friends," cried he when he went on deck at daybreak. "Come, I need your arms." "We are ready, Captain Sand," replied old Tom. "Ready for everything," added Hercules. "There was nothing to do during that tempest, and I begin to grow rusty." "You should have blown with your big mouth," said little Jack. "I bet you would have been as strong as the wind." "That is an idea, Jack," replied Dick Sand, laughing. When there is a calm, we shall make Hercules blow on the sails. At your service, Mr. Dick, replied the brave black, inflating his cheeks like a gigantic boreas. Now, my friends, continued the novice, we are to begin by binding a spare sail to the yard, because our topsail was carried away in the hurricane. It will be difficult, perhaps, but it must be done. It shall be done, replied Actaeon. Can I help you? Asked little Jack, always ready to work. Yes, my Jack, replied the novice. You will take your place at the wheel with our friend Bat, and you will help him to steer. If little Jack was proud of being assistant helmsman on the Pilgrim, it is superfluous to say so. Now to work, continued Dick Sand, and we must expose ourselves as little as possible. The blacks, guided by the novice, went to work at once. To fasten a topsail to its yard presented some difficulties for Tom and his companions. First, the rolled-up sail must be hoisted, then fastened to the yard. However, Dick Sand commanded so well, and was so well obeyed, that after an hour's work the sail was fastened to its yard, the yard hoisted, and the topsail properly set with 2 reefs. As to the foresail and the second jib, which had been furled before the tempest, those sails were set without a great deal of trouble, in spite of the force of the wind. At last, on that day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Pilgrim was sailing under her foresail, her topsail, and her jib. Dick Sand had not judged it prudent to set more sail. The canvas which he carried ought to assure him, as long as the wind did not moderate, a speed of at least 200 miles in 24 hours, and he did not need any greater to reach the American coast before 10 days. The novice was indeed satisfied when, returning to the wheel, he again took his post, after thanking Master Jack, assistant helmsman of the Pilgrim. He was no longer at the mercy of the waves. He was making headway. His joy will be understood by all those who are somewhat familiar with the things of the sea. The next day the clouds still ran with the same velocity, but they left large openings between them, through which the rays of the sun made their way to the surface of the waters. The Pilgrim was at times overspread with them. A good thing is that vivifying light. Sometimes it was extinguished behind a large mass of vapors which came up in the east, then it reappeared, to disappear again, but the weather was becoming fine again. The scuttles had been opened to ventilate the interior of the ship. A salubrious air penetrated the hold, the rear hatchway, the crew's quarters. They put the wet sails to dry, stretching them out in the sun. The deck was also cleaned. Dick Sand did not wish his ship to arrive in port without having made a bit of toilet. Without overworking the crew, a few hours spent each day at that work would bring it to a good end. Though the novice could no longer throw the log, he was so accustomed to estimating the headway of a ship that he could take a close account of her speed. He had then no doubt of reaching land before 7 days, and he gave that opinion to Mrs. Weldon, after showing her, on the chart, the probable position of the ship. "Well, at what point of the coast shall we arrive, my dear Dick?" she asked him. "Here, Mrs. Weldon," replied the novice, indicating that long coastline which extends from Peru to Chile. "I do not know how to be more exact. Here is the Isle of Pax that we have left behind in the west, and by the direction of the wind, which has been constant, I conclude that we shall reach land in the east. Ports are quite numerous on that coast, but to name the one we shall have in view when we make the land is impossible at this moment." "Well, Dick, whichever it may be, that port will be welcome." "Yes, Mrs. Weldon, and you will certainly find there the means to return promptly to San Francisco. The Pacific Navigation Company has a very well organized service on this coast. Its steamers touch at the principal points of the coast. Nothing will be easier than to take passage for California." "Then you do not count on bringing the Pilgrim to San Francisco?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Yes, after having put you on shore, Mrs. Weldon. If we can procure an officer and a crew, we are going to discharge our cargo at Valparaiso, as Captain Hull would have done. Then we shall return to our own port. But that would delay you too much, and, though very sorry to be separated from you." "Well, Dick," replied Mrs. Weldon, "we shall see later what must be done. Tell me, you seem to fear the dangers which the land presents." "In fact, they are to be feared," replied the novice, "but I am always hoping to meet some ship in these parts, and I am even very much surprised at not seeing any. If only one should pass, we would enter into communication with her. She would give us our exact situation, which would greatly facilitate our arrival in sight of land." "Are there not pilots who do service along this coast?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "There ought to be," replied Dick Sand, "but much nearer land. We must then continue to approach it." "And if we do not meet a pilot?" asked Mrs. Weldon, who kept on questioning him in order to know how the young novice would prepare for all contingencies. "In that case, Mrs. Weldon, either the weather will be clear, the wind moderate, and I shall endeavor to sail up the coast sufficiently near to find a refuge, or the wind will be stronger, and then—" "Then what will you do, Dick?" "Then, in the present condition of the Pilgrim," replied Dick Sand, "once near the land, it will be very difficult to set off again." "What will you do?" repeated Mrs. Weldon. "I shall be forced to run my ship aground," replied the novice, whose brow darkened for a moment. "Ah, it is a hard extremity. God grant that we may not be reduced to that. But I repeat it, Mrs. Weldon, the appearance of the sky is reassuring, and it is impossible for a vessel or a pilot boat not to meet us. Then, good hope. We are headed for the land, we shall see it before long." Yes, to run a ship aground is a last extremity, to which the most energetic sailor does not resort without fear. Thus, Dick Sand did not wish to foresee it, while he had some chances of escaping it. For several days there were, in the state of the atmosphere, alternatives which, anew, made the novice very uneasy. The wind kept in the condition of a stiff breeze all the time, and certain oscillations of the barometrical column indicated that it tended to freshen. Dick Sand then asked himself, not without apprehension, if he would be again forced to scud without sails. He had so much interest in keeping at least his topsail, that he resolved to do so so long as it was not likely to be carried away. But, to secure the solidity of the masts, he had the shrouds and backstays hauled taut. Above all unnecessary risk must be avoided, as the situation would become one of the gravest if the Pilgrim should be disabled by losing her masts. Once or twice, also, the barometer rising gave reason to fear that the wind might change point for point. That is to say, that it might pass to the east. It would then be necessary to sail close to the wind. A new anxiety for Dick Sand. What should he do with a contrary wind? Tack about, but if he was obliged to come to that, what new delays and what risks of being thrown into the offing? Happily those fears were not realized. The wind, after shifting for several days, blowing sometimes from the north, sometimes from the south, settled definitely in the west. But it was always a strong breeze, almost a gale, which strained the masting. It was the 5th of April. So then, more than 2 months had already elapsed since the Pilgrim had left New Zealand. For 20 days, a contrary wind and long calms had retarded her course. Then she was in a favorable condition to reach land rapidly. Her speed must even have been very considerable during the tempest. Dick Sand estimated its average at not less than 200 miles a day. How, then, had he not yet made the coast? Did it flee before the Pilgrim? It was absolutely inexplicable. And nevertheless, no land was signaled, though one of the blacks kept watch constantly in the crossbars. Dick Sand often ascended there himself. There, with a telescope to his eyes, he sought to discover some appearance of mountains. The Andes chain is very high. It was there in the zone of the clouds that he must seek some peak, emerging from the vapors of the horizon. Several times Tom and his companions were deceived by false indications of land. They were only vapors of an odd form, which rose in the background. It happened sometimes that these honest men were obstinate in their belief, but after a certain time, they were forced to acknowledge that they had been dupes of an optical illusion. The pretended land moved away, changed form, and finished by disappearing completely. On the 6th of April, there was no longer any doubt possible. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Dick Sand had just descended into the bars. At that moment the fogs were condensed under the first rays of the sun, and the horizon was pretty clearly defined. From Dick Sand's lips escaped at last the so long expected cry. "Land, land before us." At that cry everyone ran on deck, little Jack, curious as folks are at that age, Mrs. Weldon, whose trials were going to cease with the landing, Tom and his companions, who were at last going to set foot again on the American continent, Cousin Benedict himself, who had great hope of picking up quite a rich collection of new insects for himself. Negoro, alone, did not appear. Each then saw what Dick Sand had seen, some very distinctly, others with the eyes of faith. But on the part of the novice, so accustomed to observe sea horizons, there was no error possible, and an hour after, it must be allowed he was not deceived. At a distance of about 4 miles to the east stretched a rather low coast, or at least what appeared such. It must be commanded behind by the high chain of the Andes, but the last zone of clouds did not allow the summits to be perceived. The Pilgrim sailed directly and rapidly to this coast, which grew larger to the eye. 2 hours after it was only 3 miles away. This part of the coast ended in the northeast by a pretty high cape, which covered a sort of roadstead protected from land winds. On the contrary, in the southeast, it lengthened out like a thin peninsula. A few trees crowned a succession of low cliffs, which were then clearly defined under the sky. But it was evident, the geographical character of the country being given, that the high mountain chain of the Andes formed their background. Moreover, no habitation in sight, no port, no river mouth, which might serve as a harbor for a vessel. At that moment, the Pilgrim was running right on the land. With the reduced sail which she carried, the winds driving her to the coast, Dick Sand would not be able to set off from it. In front lay a long band of reefs, on which the sea was foaming all white. They saw the waves unfurl halfway up the cliffs. There must be a monstrous surf there. Dick Sand, after remaining on the forecastle to observe the coast, returned aft, and, without saying a word, he took the helm. The wind was freshening all the time. The schooner was soon only a mile from the shore. Dick Sand then perceived a sort of little cove, into which he resolved to steer. But before reaching it, he must cross a line of reefs, among which it would be difficult to follow a channel. The surf indicated that the water was shallow everywhere. At that moment Dingo, who was going backwards and forwards on the deck, dashed forward, and looking at the land, gave some lamentable barks. One would say that the dog recognized the coast, and that its instinct recalled some sad remembrance. Negoro must have heard it, for an irresistible sentiment led him out of his cabin, and although he had reason to fear the dog, he came almost immediately to lean on the netting. Very fortunately for him, Dingo, whose sad barks were all the time being addressed to that land, did not perceive him. Negoro looked at that furious surf, and that did not appear to frighten him. Mrs. Weldon, who was looking at him, thought she saw his face redden a little, and that for an instant his features were contracted. Then, did Negoro know this point of the continent, where the winds were driving the Pilgrim? At that moment Dick Sand left the wheel, which he gave back to old Tom. For a last time he came to look at the cove, which gradually opened. Then, Mrs. Weldon, said he in a firm voice, I have no longer any hope of finding a harbor. Before half an hour, in spite of all my efforts, the Pilgrim will be on the reefs. We must run aground. I shall not bring the ship into port. I am forced to lose her to save you. But between your safety and hers, I do not hesitate. You have done all that depended on you, Dick? Asked Mrs. Weldon. All, replied the young novice. And at once he made his preparations for stranding the ship. First of all, Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Cousin Benedict, and Nan must put on life preservers. Dick Sand, Tom, and the blacks, good swimmers, also took measures to gain the coast, in case they should be precipitated into the sea. Hercules would take charge of Mrs. Weldon. The novice took little Jack under his care. Cousin Benedict, very tranquil, however, reappeared on the deck with his entomologist box strapped to his shoulder. The novice commended him to Bat and Austin. As to Negoro, his singular calmness said plainly enough that he had no need of anybody's aid. Dick Sand, by a supreme precaution, had also brought on the forecastle 10 barrels of the cargo containing whale's oil. That oil, properly poured the moment the Pilgrim would be in the surf, ought to calm the sea for an instant, in lubricating, so to say, the molecules of water, and that operation would perhaps facilitate the ship's passage between the reefs. Dick Sand did not wish to neglect anything which might secure the common safety. All these precautions taken, the novice returned to take his place at the wheel. The Pilgrim was only 2 cables' lengths from the coast, that is, almost touching the reefs, her starboard side already bathed in the white foam of the surf. Each moment the novice thought that the vessel's keel was going to strike some rocky bottom. Suddenly, Dick Sand knew, by a change in the color of the water, that a channel lengthened out among the reefs. He must enter it bravely without hesitating, so as to make the coast as near as possible to the shore. The novice did not hesitate. A movement of the helm thrust the ship into the narrow and sinuous channel. In this place the sea was still more furious, and the waves dashed on the deck. The blacks were posted forward, near the barrels, waiting for the novice's orders. Pour the oil, pour, exclaimed Dick Sand. Under this oil, which was poured on it in quantities, the sea grew calm, as by enchantment, only to become more terrible again a moment after. The Pilgrim glided rapidly over those lubricated waters and headed straight for the shore. Suddenly, a shock took place. The ship, lifted by a formidable wave, had just stranded, and her masting had fallen without wounding anybody. The Pilgrim's hull, damaged by the collision, was invaded by the water with extreme violence. But the shore was only half a cable's length off, and a chain of small blackish rocks enabled it to be reached quite easily. So, 10 minutes after, all those carried by the Pilgrim had landed at the foot of the cliff. Chapter 14. The Best to Do. So then, after a voyage long delayed by calms, then favored by winds from the northwest and from the southwest, a voyage which had not lasted less than 74 days, the Pilgrim had just run aground. However, Mrs. Weldon and her companions thanked Providence because they were in safety. In fact, it was on a continent, and not on one of the fatal isles of Polynesia, that the tempest had thrown them. Their return to their country, from any point of South America on which they should land, ought not, it seemed, to present serious difficulties. As to the Pilgrim, she was lost. She was only a carcass without value, of which the surf was going to disperse the debris in a few hours. It would be impossible to save anything. But if Dick Sand had not that joy of bringing back a vessel intact to his shipowner, at least, thanks to him, those who sailed in her were safe and sound on some hospitable coast, and among them the wife and child of James W. Weldon. As to the question of knowing on what part of the American coast the schooner had been wrecked, they might dispute it for a long time. Was it, as Dick Sand must suppose, on the shore of Peru? Perhaps, for he knew, even by the bearings of the Isle of Pax, that the Pilgrim had been thrown to the northeast under the action of the winds, and also, without doubt, under the influence of the currents of the equatorial zone. From the 43rd degree of latitude, it had indeed been possible to drift to the 15th. It was then important to determine, as soon as possible, the precise point of the coast where the schooner had just been lost. Granted that this coast was that of Peru, ports, towns, and villages were not lacking, and consequently it would be easy to gain some inhabited place. As to this part of the coast, it seemed deserted. It was a narrow beach, strewed with black rocks, shut off by a cliff of medium height, very irregularly cut up by large funnels due to the rupture of the rock. Here and there a few gentle declivities gave access to its crest. In the north, at a quarter of a mile from the stranding place, was the mouth of a little river, which could not have been perceived from the offing. On its banks hung numerous rhizomas, sorts of mangroves, essentially distinct from their congeners of India. The crest of the cliff, that was soon discovered, was overhung by a thick forest, whose verdant masses undulated before the eyes and extended as far as the mountains in the background. There, if Cousin Benedict had been a botanist, how many trees, new to him, would not have failed to provoke his admiration? There were high baobabs, to which, however, an extraordinary longevity has been falsely attributed, the bark of which resembles Egyptian syenite, bourbon palms, white pines, tamarind trees, pepper plants of a peculiar species, and 100 other plants that an American is not accustomed to see in the northern region of the new continent. But, a circumstance rather curious, among those forest productions, one would not meet a single specimen of that numerous family of palm trees, which counts more than 1,000 species, spread in profusion over almost the whole surface of the globe. Above the seashore, a great number of very noisy birds were flying, which belonged for the greater part to different varieties of swallows, of black plumage with a steel blue shade, but of a light chestnut color on the upper part of the head. Here and there also rose some partridges, with necks entirely white and of a gray color. Mrs. Weldon and Dick Sand observed that these different birds did not appear to be at all wild. They approached without fearing anything. Then, had they not yet learned to fear the presence of man, and was this coast so deserted that the detonation of a firearm had never been heard there? At the edge of the rocks were walking some pelicans of the species of pelican minor, occupied in filling with little fish the sack which they carry between the branches of their lower jaw. Some gulls, coming from the offing, commenced to fly about around the Pilgrim. Those birds were the only living creatures that seemed to frequent this part of the coast, without counting, indeed, numbers of interesting insects that Cousin Benedict would well know how to discover. But however little Jack would have it, one could not ask them the name of the country. In order to learn it, it would be necessary to address some native. There were none there, or at least there was not one to be seen. No habitation, hut, or cabin, neither in the north, beyond the little river, nor in the south, nor finally on the upper part of the cliff, in the midst of the trees of the thick forest. No smoke ascended into the air, no indication, mark, or imprint indicated that this portion of the continent was visited by human beings. Dick Sand continued to be very much surprised. Where are we? Where can we be? He asked himself. What? Nobody to speak to. Nobody, in truth, and surely, if any native had approached, Dingo would have scented him and announced him by a bark. The dog went backward and forward on the strand, his nose to the ground, his tail down, growling secretly. Certainly very singular behavior, but neither betraying the approach of man nor of any animal whatsoever. Dick, look at Dingo, said Mrs. Weldon. Yes, that is very strange, replied the novice. It seems as if he were trying to recover a scent. Very strange indeed, murmured Mrs. Weldon, then continuing, what is Negoro doing? She asked. He is doing what Dingo is doing, replied Dick Sand. He goes, he comes, after all he is free here. I have no longer the right to control him. His service ended with the stranding of the Pilgrim. In fact, Negoro surveyed the strand, turned back, and looked at the shore and the cliff like a man trying to recall recollections and to fix them. Did he, then, know this country? He would probably have refused to reply to that question if it had been asked. The best thing was still to have nothing to do with that very unsociable personage. Dick Sand soon saw him walk from the side of the little river, and when Negoro had disappeared on the other side of the cliff, he ceased to think of him. Dingo had indeed barked when the cook had arrived on the steep bank, but became silent almost immediately. It was necessary now to consider the most pressing wants. Now, the most pressing was to find a refuge, a shelter of some kind, where they could install themselves for the time and partake of some nourishment. Then they would take counsel, and they would decide what it would be convenient to do. As to food, they had not to trouble themselves. Without speaking of the resources which the country must offer, the ship's storeroom had emptied itself for the benefit of the survivors of the shipwreck. The surf had thrown here and there among the rocks, then uncovered by the ebb tide, a great quantity of objects. Tom and his companions had already picked up some barrels of biscuit, boxes of alimentary preserves, cases of dried meat. The water not having yet damaged them, food for the little troop was secured for more time, doubtless, than they would require to reach a town or a village. In that respect there was nothing to fear. These different waifs, already put in a safe place, could no longer be taken back by a rising sea. Neither was sweet water lacking. First of all, Dick Sand had taken care to send Hercules to the little river for a few pints. But it was a cask which the vigorous Negro brought back on his shoulder, after having filled it with water fresh and pure, which the ebb of the tide left perfectly drinkable. As to a fire, if it were necessary to light one, dead wood was not lacking in the neighborhood, and the roots of the old mangroves ought to furnish all the fuel of which they would have need. Old Tom, an ardent smoker, was provided with a certain quantity of German tinder, well preserved in a box hermetically closed, and when they wanted it, he would only have to strike the tinderbox with the flint of the strand. It remained, then, to discover the hole in which the little troop would lie down, in case they must take one night's rest before setting out. And indeed, it was little Jack who found the bedroom in question, while trotting about at the foot of the cliff. He discovered, behind a turn of the rock, one of those grottos well polished, well hollowed out, which the sea herself digs when the waves, enlarged by the tempest, beat the coast. The young child was delighted. He called his mother with cries of joy and triumphantly showed her his discovery. "Good, my Jack," replied Mrs. Weldon. "If we were Robinson Crusoes, destined to live a long time on this shore, we should not forget to give your name to that grotto." The grotto was only from 10 to 12 feet long, and as many wide, but in little Jack's eyes it was an enormous cavern. At all events, it must suffice to contain the shipwrecked ones, and, as Mrs. Weldon and Nan noted with satisfaction, it was very dry. The moon being then in her first quarter, they need not fear that those neap tides would reach the foot of the cliff and the grotto in consequence. Then, nothing more was needed for a few hours' rest. 10 minutes after everybody was stretched out on a carpet of seaweed, Negoro himself thought he must rejoin the little troop and take his part of the repast, which was going to be made in common. Doubtless he had not judged it proper to venture alone under the thick forest, through which the winding river made its way. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The preserved meat, the biscuit, the sweet water, with the addition of a few drops of rum, of which Bat had saved a quarter cask, made the requisites for this repast. But if Negoro took part in it, he did not at all mingle in the conversation, in which were discussed the measures demanded by the situation of the shipwrecked. All the time, without appearing to do so, he listened to it and doubtless profited by what he heard. During this time, Dingo, who had not been forgotten, watched outside the grotto. They could be at ease. No living being would show himself on the strand without the faithful animal giving the alarm. Mrs. Weldon, holding her little Jack, half lying and almost asleep on her lap, began to speak. "Dick, my friend," said she, "in the name of all, I thank you for the devotion that you have shown us till now, but we do not consider you free yet. You will be our guide on land, as you were our captain at sea. We place every confidence in you. Speak, then, what must we do?" Mrs. Weldon, old Nan, Tom and his companions, all had their eyes fixed on the young novice. Negoro himself looked at him with a singular persistence. Evidently, what Dick Sand was going to reply interested him very particularly. Dick Sand reflected for a few moments, then, "Mrs. Weldon," said he, "the important thing is to know, first, where we are. I believe that our ship can only have made the land on that portion of the American seacoast which forms the Peruvian shore. The winds and currents must have carried her as far as that latitude. But are we here in some southern province of Peru, that is to say on the least inhabited part which borders upon the Pampas? Maybe so. I would even willingly believe it, seeing this beach so desolate, and it must be but little frequented. In that case, we might be very far from the nearest town, which would be unfortunate." "Well, what is to be done?" repeated Mrs. Weldon. "My advice," replied Dick Sand, "would be not to leave this shelter till we know our situation. Tomorrow, after a night's rest, two of us could go to discover it. They would endeavor, without going too far, to meet some natives, to inform themselves from them, and return to the grotto. It is not possible that, in a radius of 10 or 12 miles, we find nobody." "To separate," said Mrs. Weldon. "That seems necessary to me," replied the novice. "If no information can be picked up, if, as is not impossible, the country is absolutely desolate, well, we shall consider some other way of extricating ourselves." "And which of us shall go to explore?" asked Mrs. Weldon, after a moment's reflection. "That is yet to be decided," replied Dick Sand. "At all events, I think that you, Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Mr. Benedict, and Nan, ought not to quit this grotto. Bat, Hercules, Actaeon, and Austin should remain near you, while Tom and I should go forward. Negoro doubtless will prefer to remain here," added Dick Sand, looking at the head cook. "Probably," replied Negoro, who was not a man to commit himself any more than that. "We should take Dingo with us," continued the novice. "He would be useful to us during our exploration." Dingo, hearing his name pronounced, reappeared at the entrance of the grotto, and seemed to approve of Dick Sand's projects by a little bark. Since the novice had made this proposition, Mrs. Weldon remained pensive. Her repugnance to the idea of a separation, even short, was very serious. Might it not happen that the shipwreck of the Pilgrim would soon be known to the Indian tribes who frequented the seashore, either to the north or to the south, and in case some plunderers of the wrecks thrown on the shore should present themselves, was it not better for all to be united to repulse them? That objection, made to the novice's proposition, truly merited a discussion. It fell, however, before Dick Sand's arguments, who observed that the Indians ought not to be confounded with the savages of Africa or Polynesia, and any aggression on their part was probably not to be feared. But to entangle themselves in this country, without even knowing to what province of South America it belonged, nor at what distance the nearest town of that province was situated, was to expose themselves to many fatigues. Doubtless separation might have its inconveniences, but far less than marching blindly into the midst of a forest which appeared to stretch as far as the base of the mountains. "Besides," repeated Dick Sand persistently, "I cannot admit that this separation will be of long duration, and I even affirm that it will not be so. After 2 days, at the most, if Tom and I have come across neither habitation nor inhabitant, we shall return to the grotto. But that is too improbable, and we shall not have advanced 20 miles into the interior of the country before we shall evidently be satisfied about its geographical situation. I may be mistaken in my calculation, after all, because the means of fixing it astronomically have failed me, and it is not impossible for us to be in a higher or lower latitude." "Yes, you are certainly right, my child," replied Mrs. Weldon in great anxiety. "And you, Mr. Benedict," asked Dick Sand, "what do you think of this project?" "I," replied Cousin Benedict. "Yes, what is your advice?" "I have no advice," replied Cousin Benedict. "I find everything proposed good, and I shall do everything that you wish. Do you wish to remain here one day or two? That suits me, and I shall employ my time in studying this shore from a purely entomological point of view." "Do, then, according to your wish," said Mrs. Weldon to Dick Sand. "We shall remain here, and you shall depart with old Tom." "That is agreed upon," said Cousin Benedict, in the most tranquil manner in the world. "As for me, I am going to pay a visit to the insects of the country." "Do not go far away, Mr. Benedict," said the novice. "We urge you strongly not to do it." "Do not be uneasy, my boy. And above all, do not bring back too many mosquitoes," added old Tom. A few moments after, the entomologist, his precious tin box strapped to his shoulders, left the grotto. Almost at the same time, Negoro abandoned it also. It appeared quite natural to that man to be always occupied with himself. But while Cousin Benedict clambered up the slopes of the cliff to go to explore the border of the forest, he, turning round toward the river, went away with slow steps and disappeared, a second time ascending the steep bank.